In, I don't know whether any of you have read Samantha Power's book, Genocide, A Problem from Hell. She talks and explains, she's now President Obama's chief national security advisor, actually foreign security advisor. And in this book, she talks of Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who had been arguing for the crime of genocide since the 1930s. And he was a total bore. He was an impossible man who was, everyone tried to get rid of him at all the diplomatic conferences. He'd go around with his books and his raincoat. And the Canadian ambassador, in order to palmed him off on Doc Evatt in 1946. And Evatt actually saw what he was getting at, befriended him, and it is to that friendship between Lemkin and Evatt that we have the Genocide Convention, which was introduced by, during Doc Evatt's presidency, the day before the Universal Declaration. And it is, of course, today, the most important international law, the most important international convention, because America has ratified it. America tends not to ratify international conventions. They think international law is very good for other countries, but not for America. But it was ratified by Ronald Reagan in 1986, as a result of the fallout after he'd visited Bitburg Cemetery, where there were, and this is a story that I offer to those of you who doubt the capacity of protest. Reagan had arranged to visit Bitburg Cemetery, and it was a young, obese, bearded protester in the Midwest who realized that there were SS graves in Bitburg, and with a friend they jumped on a plane, and their banners were up when Reagan visited. Reagan honors Nazi heroes, and these pictures went round America. They caused an enormous ruction. The Jewish lobby in particular was outraged, and 3 weeks later, to satisfy them, pacify them, Ronald Reagan signed the genocide, ratified the Genocide Convention. And you know who that young, obese, bearded protester from Flint, Michigan was? It was Michael Moore, making his first, and as I told him recently, his most effective protest. But we are beginning to catch up on, we're beginning to realize Doc Evatt's dream of a global society bounded by a rule of law. Of course, it started with the Pinochet case, when Pinochet came to London, as he had so often before, to take tea with Mrs. Thatcher, although I'm reliably told it was whiskey. And he was put in, he was subject to an arrest warrant. And no one believed at that time that the Torture Convention meant what it said. And indeed, the first decision by the House of Lords, 3-2 only, that he should be tried. And then they found one of the judges had a wife who worked part-time for Amnesty International, so they had to hear the case all over again. And they had to find 7 judges who wouldn't know a human right if they fell over it. And they got 7 former commercial lawyers who had no knowledge of international law. They simply believed that contracts meant what they said. And so they were... the Torture Convention, which had been ratified by Pinochet and by Mrs. Thatcher, meant what it said when it said that torturers should go to trial. We still have problems. We had a big fight over Saddam Hussein, and I was one of the British judges who trained the Iraqis at a time when we thought it would be an international court, and that it would be there'd be international judges as well as Iraqis dealing with Saddam for genocide over the Kurds in Halabja. And we had a big fight with the Americans because if you're going to have an international court, you can't have the death penalty. And Americans said, we've got to execute him. We said, he can't stay in Iraq. Okay, we said, we'll take him to Finland, where everyone else goes. Finland! conjugal visits. They've got 140 cable television channels, most of them showing pornography. We can't have Saddam in Finland. So I suggested that we do what they did with Napoleon and put him on St. Helena if he was convicted. And the British Foreign Office took this seriously enough to make an inquiry of the St. Helenans as to whether they would take him. They said, well, actually, we're trying to develop a tourist industry, and we don't think Saddam would be appropriate. So there are problems still, and there are particular problems, of course, with having the United Nations do anything about free speech or democracy, because sadly most members of the United Nations are not supportive of free speech, and many of them are not democracies. I want to say finally something about my book, which I've dropped here, The Statute of Liberty, How Australians Can Take Back Their Rights. This was promoted by Glee Books with a typo, How Australians Can Take Back Their Tights. I thought Kathy had been at the titles. But there are lots of tedious arguments that are being arranged against it. For me, there are really 5 simple reasons. First of all, Australia has a great history in humanity. The first, in 1787, in the Admiralty, while Arthur Phillip was waiting so rightly for the first fleet to be properly provisioned, he wrote the first law for a country that only he thought would ever amount to anything more than an open prison. And that first law was that in a free country there can be no slavery, therefore in this country there shall be no slaves. And the first law outlawing slavery, 20 years before, Wilberforce achieved the victory in 1807. That's not a bad start. There was, I've mentioned Francis Forbes and free speech, trial by jury, the fight for, in 1878, the Shearers' strike, which produced not only the ALP, but Waltzing Matilda and Blood on the Wattle from Henry Lawson, and those wonderful reforms in which Australia led the world in workers' rights, in the basic wage, in even the smoko, the great right, which was an Australian first, the right of workers to have downtime. This is a wonderful history that can be summarized in a Bill of Rights. Secondly, in 10 years in Britain, we've found that the Bill of Rights works for what lawyers condescendingly call ordinary people, by which they mean people who aren't lawyers, but it gives individuals the right to a fair go when they're badly treated by bloody-minded bureaucrats. It is just a right to fairness when you're up against state government departments. Thirdly, and most importantly, the aged, the vulnerable, the mentally handicapped children. It's been a terrific boon for civilized treatment, because what the Bill of Rights is based on now is the right of humans to a minimum amount of dignity that's given up on natural rights. The genius of Priestley and Milne and Wells has made this a great advantage, and lawyers aren't involved. It's really doctors, nurses, people in mental homes and the like who are simply stopping all those practices. I could go on and tell you some of the practices that obtain in Britain that have been stopped by a Bill of Rights recognition of the right to privacy